What is happening right now beneath the ancient, densely populated, and volcanologically extraordinary landscape of Campi Flegrei, the vast supervolcanic caldera system that underlies the western suburbs of Naples, Italy, and that has been the subject of increasing scientific alarm, increasing monitoring intensity, and increasing emergency preparedness concern from volcanologists, geophysicists, civil protection authorities, and the Italian government for a period of years that has now culminated in the detection of activity levels not seen since the period immediately preceding the last major eruption of this system, an event that reshuffled the geological and human landscape of this region in ways that the geological record has preserved, and that modern science has been working to understand precisely because understanding what preceded that eruption is the key to recognizing when the next one might be approaching is not something that can be accurately described as routine volcanic unrest, not something that falls within the range of background activity that scientists monitoring active volcanic systems learn to treat as normal expressions of geological restlessness that carry no immediate implications for the communities living in the shadow of the system being monitored, and not something that the scientific community charged with watching Campi Flegrei is treating with anything less than the full urgency, the full analytical attention, and the full communication effort that a volcanic system of this size, this complexity, this proximity to millions of human beings, and this demonstrated capacity for catastrophic eruption demands from the scientists, the emergency managers, and the government officials who share the responsibility of protecting one of the most densely populated volcanic hazard zones on the surface of the Earth. Campi Flegrei is not simply a volcano. It is a supervolcanic system of a scale, a complexity, and a destructive potential that places it in a category of geological hazard that only a handful of locations on Earth can claim. A system whose last major eruption in 1538 created an entirely new mountain in a matter of days, from an eruption that by the standards of what Campi Flegrei is capable of producing was a relatively modest expression of a system that, in its most dramatic, prehistoric expressions produced eruptions so large, so globally consequential, and so dramatically landscape transforming that their evidence persists in the geological record across vast distances from the source, and that the scientific community studying them has concluded were events capable of triggering climate changes detectable across the entire northern hemisphere. The caldera itself, the enormous sunken depression that marks the center of the Campi Flegrei system, and that was formed by the collapse of the ground surface into the magma chamber below during the most massive prehistoric eruptions of the system, is a structure of extraordinary size that contains within its boundaries not just the geological infrastructure of an active supervolcanic system, but also a significant portion of the urban area of the Naples metropolitan region, including the city of Pozzuoli and numerous other communities whose residents live directly above and within the boundaries of a volcanic caldera that the geological record demonstrates has erupted catastrophically, multiple times in the deep past, and that the current monitoring data is suggesting is now reaching a state of activity that has not been observed since the period immediately instruments that volcanologists have deployed throughout the Campi Flegrei system. Seismometers recording the continuous microseismic activity that reflect the movement of fluids, gases, and magma within the volcanic system. GPS stations measuring ground deformation with millimeter precision to track the inflation and deflation of the caldera that accompanies changes in the pressure of the magmatic and hydrothermal systems beneath the surface, geochemical monitoring systems analyzing the composition and the flux of gases being emitted from the numerous fumarolic vents. Depressurization of the subsurface volcanic system have been detecting and recording with increasing concern over a period of escalating unrest that has been the subject of growing scientific alarm and growing public attention across Italy and internationally. The ground deformation at Campi Flegrei, the bradyseism phenomenon in which the ground surface within the caldera rises and falls over, showing a sustained and accelerating uplift trend that has now raised the ground surface within portions of the caldera by amounts that, when placed in the context of the historical and geological record of ground deformation at Campi Flegrei, represent a level of uplift not documented since the period of elevated activity that preceded the activity of a volcanic eruption at the system. The seismic activity at Campi Flegrei, the earthquakes, both the felt earthquakes that residents of the Pozzuoli area and the surrounding communities have been experiencing with increasing frequency and increasing intensity over the period of escalating unrest, and the microseismic activity that only the sensitive instruments of the monitoring network can detect, has been increasing in both frequency and in the maximum magnitude of individual events in ways that reflect the progressive pressurization and fracturing of the rock mass above the magmatic system, processes that generate seismic energy as the pressurized fluids and gases of the volcanic system force their way through rock that is increasingly stressed, increasingly fractured, and increasingly permeable to the upward migration of volcanic gases and hydrothermal fluids that the elevated pressure of the subsurface system is driving toward the surface. The gas emissions from the fumarolic vents within the Campi Flegrei caldera, the emissions of steam, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and other volcanic gases that are the surface expression of the degassing of the magmatic system beneath, have been showing changes in both the volume of gas being emitted and in the composition of the gas mixture that provide important information about the depth and the temperature of the processes occurring within the volcanic system, changes that the geochemists monitoring these emissions have been interpreting as evidence of the progressive ascent of magmatic material towards shallower crustal levels, a process that, if it continues, could bring magma close enough to the surface to create the conditions for a volcanic eruption on timescales that the scientific community is now discussing with an urgency that reflects the seriousness with which the available evidence is being assessed. The specific threshold that Campi Flegrei has now crossed, the level of activity not seen since the period preceding its last major eruption, is a threshold whose significance derives not from any single measurement or any single indicator, but from the convergence of multiple independent monitoring streams simultaneously showing values or trends that together create a picture of a volcanic system that is in a state of activity qualitatively different from and quantitatively more intense than anything the modern monitoring network has previously recorded, a convergence that volcanologists working on the system are treating with the seriousness that the historical association of comparable activity levels with volcanic eruption at this specific location demands. The population exposure to the potential consequences of escalating volcanic activity at Campi Flegrei is one of the defining dimensions of this volcanic hazard situation that distinguishes it from volcanic hazards in less densely populated settings, and that gives the current escalation of activity at this system a human consequence dimension of extraordinary gravity, because the communities within the Campi Flegrei caldera and the broader area of potential volcanic impact encompassing the Naples metropolitan region represent one of the largest concentrations of human population in the proximity of an active volcanic system anywhere on Earth, a concentration whose safe evacuation in the event of a volcanic eruption would represent one of the largest and most complex emergency evacuation operations ever attempted in the history of civil emergency management. The Italian Civil Protection Department, the government agency responsible for coordinating emergency preparedness and emergency response for natural disasters, including volcanic eruptions across Italy, has been engaged in an extended and intensifying process of planning, preparation, and public communication in response to the escalating activity at Campi Flegrei that has included the development and the progressive refinement of evacuation plans for the communities within the highest risk zones of the caldera, the prepositioning of emergency resources and emergency response infrastructure, the conducting of evacuation exercises designed to test the logistical feasibility of moving large numbers of people out of the highest risk areas on the timescales that a volcanic emergency would demand, and the communication with the public about the volcanic hazard, the monitoring system, the alert levels, and the actions that residents of the affected communities should be prepared to take in response to changes in the official volcanic alert level that might signal the approach of a volcanic eruption. The alert level system that Italy uses to communicate the state of volcanic unrest at Campi Flegrei, a color-coded system with green representing baseline activity, yellow representing elevated unrest, orange representing further elevated unrest with increased eruption probability, and red representing imminent eruption, has been at the yellow level for an extended period and has been the subject of scientific and governmental discussion about whether the current activity levels warrant an elevation to orange, a discussion whose existence and whose seriousness reflects the degree to which the scientific community monitoring Campi Flegrei is genuinely concerned about the trajectory of the current unrest episode, and the degree to which the available evidence is pushing against the boundaries of the yellow alert level's intended characterization of the volcanic system's state. The historical precedent of the 1538 eruption of Monte Nuovo, the last major eruption of the Campi Flegrei system, and the event whose precursory activity the current monitoring data is being compared to in the assessments that are generating such alarm, provides both a reference point for understanding what the current activity levels might mean, and a sobering reminder of the speed with which volcanic systems can transition from elevated unrest to active eruption once the critical thresholds of pressurization, fracturing, and magma ascent have been crossed. The 1538 eruption was preceded by a period of intense ground uplift, elevated seismicity, and increased gas emissions that bear resemblance to the current activity, and that gave the population of the area some warning of the approaching eruption. Though the timescale between the most intense precursory activity and the onset of the eruption was measured in days rather than the weeks or months that a modern evacuation of the current population would require, a discrepancy that makes the current focus on preparedness and the current discussion of alert level elevation a matter of genuine life safety consequence for the hundreds of thousands of people living within the highest risk zones of the Campi. Flegrei caldera. The scientific community's uncertainty about what the current activity at Campi Flegrei ultimately means, whether it represents the progressive approach of a volcanic eruption on a timescale of months to years, whether it represents a period of intense but ultimately non-eruptive unrest that will eventually subside without producing an eruption as previous unrest episodes at this system have done, or whether it represents something in between, is an uncertainty that the available monitoring data, however comprehensive and however sophisticated, cannot resolve with the certainty that the magnitude of the human consequence at stake would ideally demand, because volcanic systems of the complexity of Campi Flegrei do not follow predictable scripts and do not always produce eruptions, even when their activity reaches levels that the geological record associates with eruptive episodes, making the communication of volcanic hazard at this system a challenge of extraordinary difficulty that requires conveying genuine uncertainty without understating genuine risk to a public that deserves honest and complete information about the geological situation unfolding beneath their homes and their communities. What the Italian authorities, the volcanological community, and the civil protection system are attempting to achieve in their response to Campi Flegrei reaching activity levels not seen since the period before its last major eruption, is the kind of precautionary, preparedness-focused, scientifically grounded response that represents the best available approach to a volcanic hazard situation characterized by genuine uncertainty about timing and magnitude, but by the kind of elevated risk that the convergence of monitoring indicators is unambiguously communicating to the scientists who are watching the system with the closest attention and the most sophisticated tools that modern volcanology can bring to bear on one of the most consequential volcanic hazard situations on the planet. The residents of the communities within and around the Campi Flegrei caldera, who are living with the daily reality of felt earthquakes, visible ground deformation, and the awareness that the volcanic system beneath their homes has reached activity levels not seen since the period before its last major eruption, deserve not just honest and complete information about the current scientific understanding of the situation, but also the most effective possible emergency preparedness guidance, the most detailed possible information about evacuation plans and evacuation routes, and the most clear possible communication about what changes in the monitoring data or the official alert level would signal the need for immediate action. Communication that the Italian Civil Protection Department and the volcanological community monitoring Campi Flegrei are working to provide with the urgency and the comprehensiveness that the gravity of the situation demands. Campi Flegrei has just reached a level not seen since its last major eruption. The scientific community is watching. Yet with alarm and intensity, the Italian civil protection system is preparing with urgency and seriousness, and every person with any connection to this region, any interest in volcanic hazards, or any concern about the human consequences of geological events of this potential magnitude needs to understand what is happening, what it means, and why. The convergence of monitoring indicators that have now crossed the threshold of activity, not documented since the period preceding the last major eruption of one of the most consequential supervolcanic systems on Earth, represents a situation of the highest geological and human significance that deserves the most serious, the most informed, and the most urgently communicated attention that the scientific community, the emergency management system, and the global public interested in the intersection of geology and human welfare can provide. Like this video, if this complete and deeply informed analysis of what Campi Flegrei reaching activity levels not seen since its last major eruption actually means for the volcanic hazard situation, the human population at risk, and the emergency preparedness challenge facing one of the most volcanologically significant and most densely populated volcanic hazard zones on Earth, gave you the understanding, the context, and the genuine appreciation of the significance of this extraordinary geological situation that an event of this magnitude demands, subscribe to this channel for the kind of serious, scientifically grounded, and genuinely illuminating coverage of the geological and natural hazard events that are shaping the safety and the future of human communities around the world. And tell me in the comments what you think the Italian government and the scientific community should be doing right now in response to Campi Flegrei reaching this alarming threshold. See you in the next one.